Good memory, you know, sweet memories from old times. Let me present first Alan Rusbridger, because he was, at the time of the Snowden revelations, the editor-in-chief in The Guardian, which actually published, together with the Washington Post, as I understand, the revelations he came up with. Could you give us some remarks about how you were thinking and what the ideas behind it was, and how this cooperation actually came about?
Well, it was the first time that anyone had ever leaked anything for the NSA. It was known as no such agency at the time because nothing had ever leaked. It was the most secret. So the act of publishing, I don't know if anybody has seen the film of Snowden, which has just come out, the Oliver Snowden, which gives you some impression of the speed at which decisions were having to be made. Because you had a man who was the most wanted man on earth with these secrets that had never been seen before in a hotel room in Hong Kong. I had never met him. No one had met him. He was under intense pressure because he was almost certainly about to be hunted down, even if he wasn't being hunted down. And we had to take a number of decisions that were, for me, and I'd been editing then for 18 years, they were the most complex set of moral, legal, ethical, journalistic, security, ethical questions that we had ever encountered, and technologically complex questions. I think, looking back, that I think we did it pretty well.
Did he contact you?
He contacted Bart Gellman of the Washington Post and Glenn Greenwald of the Guardian at the same time, and I sent a staff member, Ewan McCaskill, and the Washington Post decided not to go to Hong Kong, so it was the two Guardian reporters and Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, who were in that room.
So it was a well-planned action from his side, then. I mean, it was yeah. But how were you able to check the credibility of what he said and did? I mean, how could you check the value of it all?
Well,
the dimensions of it, and yeah.
I mean, he was who he said he was, and that became apparent fairly soon. And the rest of it was just the documents. The documents were obviously real. There was no doubt about that. And in the end, I think journalists have to sort of separate off the source and the motives of the source and just look at the documents and say, well, what are these documents telling us? Are they revealing things of public importance and value? And how can we publish them responsibly?
But you had to transfer it into a language which people could understand.
Yeah, I mean, they were if you're not from this world.
We got
and few of us are. I mean, these were documents that were written in. They were almost impenetrable. Some of them, back in London, we had 2 or 3 investigative reporters who'd done, 30 or 40 years in journalism, and one of them, after a week, said, "Actually, I'm not sure there's anything in this." Partly because he just didn't understand it, and a lot of it was written in code. So, for instance, every telecom provider who was co-opted by the British or American state as part of the surveillance machinery, it didn't say Verizon or British Telecom or Vodafone. They all had code names, and so we had to work out who all the code names were. But gradually the documents began to yield the secrets that we saw, and I think as Snowden was saying today, I think the publication was generally of value in aiding a debate, and I think even people in the intelligence services, I mean, we can argue about whether the laws that have been passed in Britain now are better or worse, but at least there's been a democratic debate, and the sky hasn't fallen in. The state has come out and said, yes, we do all this stuff, and we intend to carry on doing it. Are you happy about it? And Parliament said yes, and that's fine. There's been a democratic decision. The sky hasn't fallen in. They're going to have increased powers, and I think that's all that Snowden wanted. I mean, I think he would have rather the British government decided in a different direction, but at least the people have been allowed to make a decision, and that I think was his most important thing
But
that he wanted.
Did you get the feeling that the sky was actually falling in when the Washington Post, not very long ago, in an editorial, said that Edward Snowden should be extradited and put in front of a court?
Well, I thought that was
It's rather strange, wasn't it?
eccentric. I mean, American journalism has this separation between the newsroom and the comment bit of the paper, which is either admirable or odd. And under the American system, they decided that the comment page would have a different view. And so the paper, which had said these were of such importance that we decided to publish them. And by the way, thank you very much for the Pulitzer Prize for public service. And then their colleagues on a different floor said, we disagree. That's either mad or wonderful. You choose.
Part of the game of modern press in a way, not actually something to cry about. That's the way it is it? I'd like to raise the question to the two Norwegian politicians here. We see what happened in the United States, and we hear how things are being conducted, how people are using the present regulations. Do we have the same problems, actually? We don't know very much of it, and that's about the character of the whole affair. But do we have to be just as aware of these problems as they are in the United States for the time being? Should we take Michael?
Yes, of course. We should be vigilant to the problem all the way, because we haven't achieved one final victory for the rule of law. We have to defend it all the way, all the time. And I can assure you that this is not the highest priority topic for the politicians for the time being, because of the occasions. You have the terrorism. You have the awful occasions in Paris. So we are unfortunately seeing that the electorate is tolerating a lot of rules and lawmaking, really to be afraid of if you didn't have the highest expectations for the authorities. But in Norway we have also a high degree of trust to the authorities. So if that is not wrecked by any accident, we will still in Norway not have the opinion pressure for the regulation of new laws, I'm afraid. But we have to be vigilant. I would also like to add, because William said at the beginning of the meeting that Ossietzky was revealing the reinforcement after the Versailles Treaty. But I think it was not the Nazis who put him behind bars. It was actually a democratic government. So he was, when Hitler took power, he had been in jail for 2 years. And the ruling majority was a social democratic one in the Weimar Republics. And what we have to, because we can easily believe that the most cruel, one of the most cruel regimes of all time, the Hitler, could have invented that. But I think it's more to reflect on that actually it was a democratic constitution that paved the way for the persecution of Ossietzky. So we have to follow narrowly. Are we seeing that our institutions are declining in order to protect the individuals? That's the big question.
Snorre Valen, to give you the same question as we posed to Edward Snowden, is there a problem when the situation in the world is getting sort of more tensed, that people tend to be less aware of these questions? And does the government or the institutions of government then tend to be more restrictive in its use of the secrecy and the surveillance tactics? Is that a problem with modern society?
I think Mr. Snowden sought public debate first and foremost. He didn't seek to bring down the American security establishment. He sought debate about something he thought was principally and morally problematic. And we're better off for it today. It's a much broader debate than these isolated security measurements alone. It's the sum of all surveillance in our time. Even within the boundaries, as Mikael pointed out, even within the boundaries of a liberal functioning democracy, the sum of mass surveillance, the mere existence of these tools have a profound effect on how we live our lives. And not only the government programs. I accessed the health panel on my iPhone for the first time yesterday, and I was horrified because not only do I walk much less than I thought, but all of my life is in this box. I can turn it off. I can opt out.
Your life?
Yeah, I can turn. Yeah, and in fact turn off my social life as well. But take the growing generation these days. Imagine being a kid in Norway or the US or the UK, being subject to visibility all the time. When I was 16, I could do pretty much whatever I wanted, and I did. And
you did?
Yeah. But it's not a big problem today. But these days, people grow up, kids grow up with the knowledge that they are always potentially being broadcasted and visible, and that has a profound chilling effect on how we lead our lives. So that's the situation today. And now imagine that hypothetically, charismatic, populist, authoritarian politician starts winning elections. For instance, in Hungary or in Poland or in the US. Now we have a mass surveillance system, even if it is regulated by law and transparency and so on, being handed over to people whose popular appeal is repealing the rule of law and not respecting democratic institutions. So when developing these tools of surveillance, even though the reasons for doing so may be ever so benign and well-reasoned, you have to take into account that the tools you create, be it surveillance tools or nuclear weapons and so on, has to be able to withstand darker times and less democratic impulses into our society. And I think that's the greatest threat about the combination of ever more private mass surveillance and government mass surveillance, that we do not know what consequences it may bear in, say, 5 or 10 or 20 years into the future.
Alan, what's the duty, what's the task of the press in that relation? I mean, the society is changing very rapidly in many fields, and it's going more rapidly than the political system is actually able to adapt to, because laws must necessarily come after things have happened in a way. How do you see the role of a newspaper like the one you have actually left? But I mean, The Guardian is having a very important position in sort of transmitting these things and carrying on a serious debate about them.
Well, it's the same as it always has been. I mean, the press is there to bring information into the public in an accurate and timely fashion, so that debates can take place. And it's not the role of the press to make things happen. It's simply to lay the information out so that people can discuss. And there are things that have happened in Britain. They may be happening in Norway. I don't know. In the last 2 years, for 200 or 300 years, it was the convention that lawyers could talk to their clients privately, that priests could talk to communicants privately, that doctors and their patients would have a confidential relationship, that journalists and sources would have a confidential relationship, that parliamentarians and their constituents would have a confidential relationship. These were practices and conventions that grew up over hundreds of years, and you can understand the reasons why those relationships, it's so important that they should be private. Now, at some point in the last 2 years, somebody in Whitehall in Westminster decided that the British state would not observe any of those conventions. Now, that is massive. I think it has. I don't know if there are any doctors or lawyers in the House, but that is a massive thing, not a small thing. And that's the kind of thing that ought to be discussed and debated. And of course, it's true that there is a war on terror, We understand that. We want our security services to have the powers that they need. But these things affect much more than just that. And I'm astonished at the difference between the analog world and the digital world. So in the 1760s in Britain, when the state really was under threat and was at war, from the French and from the Scots and everything else, the courts said you can't walk into an Englishman's house and seize his papers. And I dare say that if the question was posed of the audience today, if a policeman arrived at your house tonight and asked to take away all your papers, and said, look, we're not going to look at them, but we just want to keep them because we might want to look at them at some point in the future. You would all say, get lost, this is my house, and I'm not going to give them to you. If the police say, oh, by the way, we've done that anyway, and in fact, we've done a lot more than that, is that okay by you? We sort of go, okay. And so there's a huge disjunct between these things that were the civil liberties that were established in times of threat, and something about this digital world that maybe because we don't understand it properly, if we're honest, we sort of shrug and say, well, okay, but it's at the time of threat that we have to be especially vigilant about our civil rights.
John, when your ordeal was at its highest, did you ever consider leaking this to the press? I mean, not leaking in the sort of criminal way, but giving a hint to someone, or perhaps get in touch with some of your parliamentarians. I mean, member of the House or the Senate. Would that be an option for you at all?
For me, I actually helped draft the whistleblower protection law regarding intelligence community whistleblowers. And what I tried to do is I tried to set up legal mechanisms. And until 1989, that should you have classified information, that you could bring it to the Congress, but you could be actually prosecuted for it also. I set up a system whereas should a classified whistleblower want to bring information, that there was a board, and I sat on that board, and we would determine whether it was an urgent concern. If it was an urgent concern, it would be sent to the Secretary of Defense. He would have 7 days, and then he would send it to the Congress. And when I headed up the hotline also is when we had the Chelsea Manning shock, that while we understood that in the new cyber environment, that you would have tens of thousands of US employees who would have access to a volume of information that simply wasn't possible earlier. And should you have one rogue individual that they could simply collect hundreds of thousands of documents, that you had thumb drives, and so you weren't concerned about transferring physical copies because that of course limits you. But with a thumb drive, which you can keep in your pocket, you can simply have tens of thousands of documents on it. So in response to that, I set up two things. I set up a top secret whistleblower system, whereas they could actually transmit top secret documents to my office, and I set up a secret system too. But they were set up just to avoid Edward Snowden, someone like him coming forward, because we wanted to give him enough trust that he could work within the system, that once he saw the Drake trial, he then knew that he could not work within the system, and then he had a moral choice, that he could either overlook lawbreaking or he could commit a crime reporting a crime. And that's an irony. Under the law, he was actually prescribed to file a complaint, but then he was proscribed from actually making it public. And he then faced a basic conundrum. And what's unfortunate is when he did what he thought was the right thing, Edward Snowden fundamentally destroyed his life. And that's an option whistleblowers should not have to face. That should you have a whistleblowing system, someone like Snowden should have felt the actual confidence to work in the system. Drake proved that that was not possible.
We are talking about the security environment when you talk about whistleblowers
Yes.
mainly, but we do indeed have the same problem in civilian life. I mean, we have had problems in Norwegian debate, at least with people who are whistleblowers in businesses and in public civilian society and so on. There are similarities, aren't there? And one could ask whether the political system is taking sufficiently care of it. What do you think as politicians, Mikael, first, perhaps? Because, I mean, the principle is, after all, the same, isn't it?
Yeah, in principle, we have, of course, the problem with whistleblowers in one enterprise, and then they are subject to retaliation afterwards. But here you could see this dimension is more serious, because it's you could, if you as a whistleblower chose the wrong means, you could also compromise a lot of innocent people's lives. So it's a huge responsibility to go across the borderline for to be unlawful on the paper. So I also like to remind ourselves that this also includes the whole thinking of civil disobedience.
Yes.
And then you have to stick to some rules. You have also stay and take the trial, and then you can be freed or pardoned. But it's a part of the privilege of going above the boundaries of legal.
But wouldn't you say, actually, if the fear of retaliation is so predominant that the system actually not works? Because, I mean, then the fear of what could happen to you will make you refrain from saying what you have to say.
Yes, I think that's a law task of very high importance, and that's to build institutions and also a legal system where you can, after being heard in a trial, and then be freed if the public interest is so dominant part of your whistleblowing. So it has to have a happy ending. You can be freed.
Indeed, yes. I mean,
you can be
that's
freed,
the job
but
of
you
politicians, isn't it? To make
but you
sure
have
that
to submit. You have to submit and appear for independent court.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
In principle, I agree. The problem is legislation that's in place that hinders a due process of legal action. Like in the case of Snowden, he's not allowed to make in his defense the most important point of them all, that his disclosures were in the public interest. So it doesn't, in reality, have the right to fair trial. So it's very much a responsibility of the lawmakers, because we have to make sure that our legislation is updated and fair and democratic and enables a true free court. The Council of Europe has made it's actually a handbook for legislation related to whistleblowers. And the legislation throughout Europe varies greatly. But I think, especially in these kinds of cases, it's difficult to hit the mark because we are, after all, talking about very grave national interests. And Mr. Snowden was aware of what he was doing when he disclosed these papers. And yes, in one way he destroyed his life, but in another way, I don't think he was surprised by the fallback from it. A very bad consequence of not having a truly transparent, fair system for whistleblowing is that you could tip the other way and make leaks and ideology. Sorry?
I think it was my fault.
Okay.
I was trying to cover a cough.
You could end up making leaks and ideology in itself. WikiLeaks is a good example of that. They have delegitimized themselves completely in my eyes because they went from disclosing actual information that helped exposing war crimes, bring about the fall of the Tunisian regime and so on, to making the leaks themselves the means. And that's a problem because then you undermine those principles you talked about earlier. If, for instance, people within a democratic structure, a democratic party, can't have confidential conversations with each other, you undermine the basic democracy that WikiLeaks claims to defend. But WikiLeaks is a product of something as well. Problem is, few lawmakers really care, and few voters really care. It's something we discuss a lot in the Literature House and in Morgenbladet and Klassekampen and on discussion boards on the web. But I think very few people cast their vote based on who will protect my privacy the most, or who will protect my right to keep secrets. Because it's a bit like climate change. It's such a slow churning change. It's like cooking a frog. You won't notice until it's too late. And that's a big challenge for all of us, regardless of the left or the right.
But you're coming back to my argument about the people constituting the water in which the fish are swimming, actually. I mean, it's a matter of making the public aware of the problems. And what Edward Snowden has done is quite obviously to spread the words about how things are going on. There is a complacency and the danger of a complacency in present-day electoral groupings by voters around in the modern societies, but will that change? I mean, we're going into another world where economic austerity and restraints is going to be a topic. People are discontent, and we've seen that discontent being exposed significantly during the American electoral campaign, etc., 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 and the Panama Papers. We're revealing that some people are misusing the means of society to a very large extent.
I don't think it's discontent in itself. I think this is one of the extreme products of the lack of trust between people and institutions that have arisen throughout all of the Western world. And that's a problem in many ways, also because it lowers the bar for the authorities and for powerful people like me and Mikael to just don't care about this anymore. So we approve this new intelligence program because people don't trust each other anyway. And it undermines, it's a domino effect coming out of it, because at the same time as Mr. Putin is establishing his authoritarian regime in Russia, it turns out that we are enabling some of the same mechanisms in our own free societies, which begs the question, with what authority can we criticize Russia for their surveillance and China for their surveillance with the moral authority that we need if we don't put an end to the widespread mass surveillance in our own world as well?
Am I right in suspecting that there is a conflict between pragmatism and idealism here, or big principles? That, I mean, the pragmatism is partly choking the principles in a way.
And the transatlantic
I'm talking
pacts.
to you, very powerful politicians.
Yeah, but I must return the question to you. Don't we all have mixed feelings when we, in principle, are very skeptical to surveillance cameras all over the inner city? But looking at after the terror actions against the airport in Brussels, we say when we see the surveillance cameras pictures, oh my God, that was really effective. Now we can trace them down and get all the assistants and helpers and the environment providing this act of terror and bring them to court. The perpetrators themselves are maybe another place, but so I took myself in have those mixed feelings, because I thought to myself, thank God somebody had the surveillance cameras in place.
Right.
But I don't like them from an idealistic point of view.
But wouldn't it be right to say that the efforts you have to make to keep terrorism at bay should have a framework or principled ideals which are very clearly stated in words? I mean, that you have the sort of principle. And is it all right as it is? I mean, this definition of a principle.
That's why we should have institutions, because we have to admit that our intelligence services, they cannot deny technical means if they are attacked by technical devices.
Catch-22.
But then we had to build oversight bodies which can discipline them, and we have tried to do that with some success in the Norwegian Parliament by the oversight body for the intelligence service.
I think the oversight body is very important. I think they have too strict a mandate. I think they have too little resources. And one of the reasons I think that is because in many respects we already have failed that test, considering that every instance we change the laws relating to surveillance or anti-terrorism and so on, it's directly following a devastating terrorism attack. It's September 11th or the 22nd of July here in Norway. Then we change the laws. And if we really claim that we have a principled approach to this, then that wouldn't be the case. We turn out to be more pragmatic. Every time something happens, we suddenly see the need for new legislation. And we even directly relate it to what's just happened. And I don't see an easy answer to that, because the need for safety and security is one of the most basic human feelings. It's very easy for me to be very principled about these things when talking about surveillance or cameras or the sum of iPhone apps that survey me. But I think after the 22nd of July as well here in Norway, many of us were greatly affected by it, personally. Did we make those reflections the weeks after or the months after? Very few of us did. And we can't blame each other for that. No, but we need some kind of structure when we decide these laws and when we debate them. And this sounds very cold and very cynic, and I'm very sorry about it, but which creates the proper amount of distance from the horrifying terrorist acts that we are subjected to. That's the only way we can make it work.
Sure.
This again, I think, is where Snowden has performed a public service, because you know, I mean, many of us may agree with many of the things that have been said on the panel about the need for CCTV and the mixed feelings that we have after terror attacks. But also, we've read R. Orwell, and if we live in Germany, we're in living memory of the terrible abuses of surveillance and totalitarian powers by all kinds of regimes. So we understand the potential for harm, and it does, in the end, come down to oversight. And it was apparent that the oversight regimes in America, the 11 cases out of 34,000, and in Britain there was a part-time committee that met on Thursday afternoons that was responsible for overseeing GCHQ, MI6, MI5, and it was these were generally politicians at the end of their careers,
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
mostly who struggled to operate their mobile phones, even old-fashioned Nokia mobile phones, never alone smartphones. And these were the people who were supposed to be in charge. And a court recently came out and said what was going on for 10 to 15 years was plainly illegal. And this had escaped the notice of these parliamentarians. But it's a non-trivial thing to try and solve it, because you clearly have to have a secrecy barrier, and you're asking people to have access to go around the other side of the curtain. But I think you don't want them to spend too long on the other side of the curtain, because then they will be co-opted by the intelligence services. That they have to have real powers, but looking at these thousands of documents that we looked at, that I'm sure the Intelligence and Security Committee never looked at, or fully understood, or had the technological understanding to be able to follow through the implications of what was happening. So we do have to think about better oversight of these powers that can be very useful and can be very, very sinister. And who knows who's going to be in charge of various European states in the next 5 years, and whether we would feel totally happy about them running these services any more than President Trump. And I think one of the fallouts from Snowden is that already we have better and more effective oversight mechanisms, because that is going to be the crucial thing.
I think that I agree wholeheartedly, and that's the main contribution from Mr. Snowden. I will, along with Borch Solhjell from my party, once again nominate Edward Snowden for the Nobel Peace Prize this January, because because his biggest contribution is starting to rebuild the trust by exposing what was obviously an illegal mass surveillance program that undermines the basic trust that citizens need to have in their government. By exposing that, he contributed to making it right again. And he helped liberal democracies remaining liberal democracies. And that's true peace building, because trust is eroding in so many ways these days, and being able to just stop for a bit and take a step back and making right some of the wrongs. It's a great contribution to world peace and stability in the long term, I think.
I think that's obviously a heavy argument for it, because actually what we are discussing is the misuse of surveillance, mass surveillance of the civilian society, and the lack of protection of those who actually sees it and can say anything about it, the whistleblowers. So, I mean, this is what it's all about, and we can all agree, I suppose, that liberal democracy is dependent on these questions. So where are we heading? I mean, what we have heard today in all respects of the word is that the world is getting extremely complicated, and that forces are arguing for an extended use of these restrictive measures, referring to a troubled situation internationally. Where is democracy headed, and what can we do with it?
I think
Should we
that-
take a round?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, no, we might begin with you. It's a long time since you had a word. So.
I think that one of the issues is what is the new normal? Because we were used to the old normal, and part of that old normal also involved technology. That for the U.S., that when we had 9/11, that there was this sudden new normal, whereas we would start to massively surveil, that the concerns Snowden had was that we had evolved to a new normal, but we were not transparent about it. And since we were not transparent about it, the will of the people through Congress wasn't aware of it either. So he tried to show through transparency that there was a new normal that was not acknowledged. Now, what he did also was that no one contested what he exposed. And what the Congress did is they then passed laws saying this new normal that we have now become aware of, we don't like, we will craft laws not making it the new normal. So when we evolve, that what's important is not so much what the new normal is. What's important is that we have the transparency so that the average person, through the electoral system, electing representatives, they can send representatives saying, is this new normal good?
So this brings up the question, what is the responsibility of the lawmakers, democratically elected?
It is to pay attention.
It is to pay attention. Your comment to that, Mikael?
Yes, they have a responsibility, but also the electorate. They have to be interested in this. They have to push their parties and politicians. And if they are not, if they're occupied, their minds are occupied with totally other items, this will not have the breakthrough in the political debate. But I hope occasions like this will heighten our awareness of this problem.
But are you afraid that the electorate is too complacent? Don't care enough about these questions?
Well, that's you shall be very anxious about criticize the electorate, but I think that the free and open discussion always will make a breakthrough for necessary legislation in the longer term.
Okay, Snorre Valen, your reactions to this?
I think we're headed towards a basic fight over principles that we've taken for granted in our part of the world. I think that the sanctity of being able to keep secrets, the sanctity of having a private life, the sanctity of the client-attorney relationship, all of these principles, and the sanctity of truth, rationality and truth, is now in play. And it hasn't been before. So I agree, you should be very careful pointing out the electorate, also because if you're, for instance, if you're a middle-class American and what you've experienced for 30 years is that you have to take 2 day jobs to get the same pay, and you've suspected all the time and being criticized for it by your relatives that you think the government is watching what you're doing. And it turns out that the government is actually watching everything you do. You might feel a bit powerless, and you might stop trusting the government. So the responsibility is very much in the hand of the lawmakers. Not only do we have to fight about the usual things, the left and right things, I want to raise the taxes and he wants to lower them, and we'll have that debate and we'll keep hanging it, but we also have to forge new alliances protecting the basic principles and mechanisms of a liberal democracy. That hasn't been in play in our part of the world for very many years, and it makes me a bit anxious. I hope to see a mobilization.
Alan, a last remark from you, please.
I think it's all very well to say the lawmakers have got to take this all more seriously. I think the problem is, and I've touched on this before, I honestly don't think they understand it. And I think there's going to be a huge problem in the 21st century where science and technology is advancing faster than the lawmakers can possibly understand. And I think lawmakers ought to undergo compulsory education, because otherwise how can they understand what's happening?
It's enough to read newspapers effectively.
Well, it's going to affect robotics, it's going to take artificial intelligence, it's going to affect medical advances. It's not just surveillance. And the West Coast firms are way ahead of anything that parliaments are discussing or understanding. And with Snowden, it came down to one thing, which was encryption. And hands up anybody who understands encryption. Okay, you're a very bright audience. So we've got about 15 people in the audience tonight who do. But to see the politicians stumbling around, because every time there was a company is hacked, or a bank is hacked, or medical records are hacked, or a government is hacked, we want better encryption. And then you have simultaneously the government saying we want weaker encryption because encryption is used by bad guys to do stuff, so we have to have backdoors into everything. You have the West Coast companies who are trying to get better encryption because actually they understand it, and they understand you can't have backdoors into things that can't be exploited by other people. And frankly, their business model is completely screwed if people believe that their encryption doesn't work. So there is a completely muddled, ill-informed debate just about that one word, encryption. But take that into science and robotics and health, and with lawmakers who, you know, they're busy people, but they simply can't reach informed decisions on this. So I think the one thing I would recommend from tonight is compulsory technology classes on a weekly basis for every single parliamentarian.
Gentlemen, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you so much. Bravo. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the program, and according to the program, the rector of the University of Oslo, Ole Petter Ottersen, should have summed up this mini-seminar, but he has prevented by the sad death of his mother, so he cannot be here tonight. Which brings us directly over to you, William, whom I would suppose that